2015. Elizabeth Holmes was the youngest female self-made billionaire in American history. Investors had given her $900 million. Walgreens had given her 8,000 store locations. She had given them fraudulent results, the machine at the center of her $9 billion empire. The Edison could not do what she claimed it could do. It had never been able to do what she claimed it could do. While Elizabeth was on the cover of Forbes, Fortune, and Time. While she was shaking hands with Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, and James Mattis. While she was giving TED Talks about democratizing healthcare. Her own scientists were telling her, internally, the technology was failing. She didn't fix it. She silenced them. Patients received false positive cancer diagnosis. Others were told they were HIV negative when they weren't. Real medical decisions were being made on fraudulent data. While Elizabeth raised another round of funding and hired another famous board member, the question was never whether Theranos worked. The question was how long she could make the world believe it did. Elizabeth Holmes was not a scientist. She had completed 1 year of chemical engineering at Stanford before dropping out. She had no medical degree, no research background, no published work in any scientific field. What she had was something more dangerous than credentials. She had certainty, an absolute unshakable conviction that she was right, and that anyone questioning her was either too small-minded to understand, or too threatened to admit it. She grew up in Washington, D.C., in a family with deep connections to government and corporate America. Her great-great-grandfather had founded Fleischmann's Yeast. Her father worked at Enron before it collapsed. A detail that would later feel less coincidental. She arrived at Stanford at 18, already certain she was going to change the world. She modeled herself explicitly on Steve Jobs. The black turtleneck was deliberate. The reality distortion field was deliberate. She studied how Jobs commanded rooms, how he spoke about products that didn't fully exist yet, as though their existence was inevitable, how he made investors and journalists and customers feel they were witnessing history. She lowered her voice, deliberately and artificially, to sound more authoritative. Former colleagues have described it as a performance she maintained at all times. In recordings made without her knowledge, her voice returned to its natural register. The baritone was a costume she wore the same way she wore the turtleneck. She dropped out of Stanford in 2003, at 19. She used her tuition money as seed funding. She founded Theranos, a combination of therapy and diagnosis. In the same year, she was going to build a device that could detect hundreds of diseases from a single drop of blood taken from a finger prick. No large needles. No laboratory wait times. Cheap enough for anyone to access. The idea was genuinely revolutionary. The technology to execute it did not exist. Elizabeth decided to raise money first, and solve that problem later. She never solved it. The Edison, Theranos's proprietary blood testing device, was supposed to be the physical proof of everything Elizabeth was selling, a compact machine that could sit in a Walgreens, take a finger prick sample, and run hundreds of diagnostic tests simultaneously, with laboratory-grade accuracy. In reality, the Edison could reliably run approximately a dozen tests. For the remaining tests, Theranos was using conventional blood testing machines, purchased from Siemens and other manufacturers. The same machines, used in standard medical laboratories everywhere. They were diluting the finger prick samples, to run them on these conventional machines, which introduced inaccuracies the machines were not designed to handle. The results were dangerously unreliable. Internal quality control data, later obtained by investigators, show that Theranos test results had a coefficient of variation significantly higher than industry standards. In plain language, the results were inconsistent in ways that made them medically unreliable. Elizabeth knew this. Her laboratory director knew this. Her president, Ramesh Balwani, her romantic partner who she had met when she was 18, and he was 37, knew this. Scientists who raised concerns internally were reassigned, marginalized, or fired. One researcher, who documented the Edison's failures, was walked out of the building the same day he raised his concerns. Non-disclosure agreements so restrictive, they prevented former employees from discussing their work, were standard practice. Elizabeth created a culture where questioning the technology, treated as an act of disloyalty rather than scientific due diligence. She raised $900 million from investors, who were never shown the actual test accuracy data. She signed a partnership with Walgreens, whose executives were never permitted to independently verify the technology. She ran patients' tests in real Walgreens locations, on real patients with real medical conditions, using a machine she knew could not produce reliable results. The most revealing element of the Theranos story is not Elizabeth Holmes. It is the people who believed her. Elizabeth constructed a board of directors, unlike anything in Silicon Valley history. Not venture capitalists. Not healthcare executives. Not scientists or medical professionals. Former Secretary of State, George Shultz. Former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Former Secretary of Defense, William Perry. Former Senate Armed Service Committee Chairman, Sam Nunn. Former Navy Admiral, Gary Roughead. Former Marine General, James Mattis, later Secretary of Defense under Donald Trump. Combined government experience, measured in centuries. Combined medical expertise, 0. Elizabeth had understood something fundamental: how power operates. Prestigious names on a board don't ask technical questions. They provide cover. They signal legitimacy to other investors, without doing the due diligence that legitimate investors require. George Shultz on your board means you don't have to prove your technology works. The implication is that someone with his experience and reputation would not be associated with something fraudulent. Rupert Murdoch invested $125 million. Betsy DeVos invested $100 million. The DeVos family invested a total of $100 million. The Walton family invested. Carlos Slim, one of the wealthiest men on earth, invested. Not one of them was shown independent verification of the Edison's accuracy. Not one of them demanded peer-reviewed data. Not one of them asked why a medical device company had no medical professionals on its board. Elizabeth raised $900 million from some of the most sophisticated investors on earth, by making them feel that asking basic questions was beneath people of their stature. The investors lost money. The patients lost everything. Theranos testing was available in Walgreens locations in Arizona and California from 2013. Real patients with real medical conditions were receiving Theranos results and making real medical decisions based on them. A man was told his PSA levels indicated possible prostate cancer. He underwent a biopsy, an invasive painful procedure. The Theranos result was wrong. A woman received a false positive for HIV. The psychological devastation of that result, the hours between receiving it and getting it retested at a conventional laboratory, was not a statistic. It was a human experience. Pregnant women received abnormal results that caused acute psychological distress. Retesting revealed the Theranos results were inaccurate. The precise number of patients harmed by inaccurate Theranos results has never been fully established. The company ran approximately 7 million tests. The percentage of those tests that produced inaccurate results, significant enough to affect medical decisions, because Theranos destroyed records and resisted investigation at every stage. What is documented is this. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services inspected the Theranos laboratory in 2015 and found deficiencies so severe, they threatened patient health and safety. Their report found that Theranos had failed to meet basic laboratory standards in ways that could have caused patient harm. Elizabeth was informed of those findings. She continued operating. The person who ended Theranos was not a regulator, not an investor, not a board member. It was a journalist, named John Carreyrou, at the Wall Street Journal, who spent 2 years building a case from former Theranos employees, willing to talk despite their non-disclosure agreements. On October 15, 2015, the Wall Street Journal published John's investigation. It documented that Theranos was using conventional machines for the majority of its test, that the Edison's capabilities were dramatically overstated, and that the company had actively concealed these facts from investors, partners, and regulators. Elizabeth's response was not to acknowledge the concerns. She went on CNBC the same day and called the story. She appeared on stage at a healthcare conference and dismissed the investigation as an attack by people who didn't understand innovation. She raised additional funding. The Wall Street Journal published follow-up investigations. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services released their inspection findings. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened an investigation. The Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation. Walgreens terminated its partnership with Theranos in June 2016. The Edison was taken off the market. The Theranos laboratory lost its federal certification, effectively making it illegal to operate. Elizabeth was banned from operating any clinical laboratory for 2 years. She spent those 2 years preparing her legal defense. In June 2018, the Department of Justice indicted Elizabeth Holmes and Ramesh Balwani on 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The government alleged they had knowingly defrauded investors, hundreds of millions of dollars, and defrauded patients who had paid for and relied upon Theranos blood tests. Elizabeth's defense strategy was striking. She claimed Balwani, her former romantic partner and company president, had psychologically abused her throughout their relationship, and his control over her had diminished her responsibility for decisions made at Theranos. She was simultaneously arguing that she was a visionary CEO who had built a $9 billion company, and that she had been too controlled by her subordinate to be fully responsible for that company's actions. The jury rejected the patient fraud counts, concluding that proving Elizabeth knew specific patients had been harmed required a level of direct evidence the prosecution could not establish beyond reasonable doubt. They convicted her on 4 counts of fraud against investors. On November 18, 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. She reported to a minimum security federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas in May 2023. Her appeals continue. Ramesh Balwani was convicted on all 12 counts against him and sentenced to nearly 13 years. George Shultz, the former Secretary of State, whose name gave Theranos its most important veneer of legitimacy, had a grandson named Tyler Shultz, who worked at Theranos and became one of John Carreyrou's key sources. Tyler Shultz discovered the test inaccuracies internally and raised them with Elizabeth directly. She dismissed his concerns. He went to regulators. Elizabeth sent lawyers after him. Tyler Shultz told his grandfather what was happening inside the company, whose board he sat on. George Shultz chose to believe Elizabeth over his own grandson. He remained on the board. He continued lending his name to a fraud that was producing inaccurate medical results for patients. He was 94 years old when Elizabeth Holmes was convicted. He died in 2021. Before the verdict, Henry Kissinger died in November 2023. The same month, Elizabeth began serving her prison sentence. Theranos was formally dissolved in September 2018. The $9 billion valuation, every dollar of it built on a technology that never worked, went to zero. Investors recovered nothing. Patients received no compensation. The Walgreens partnership, that had put fraudulent medical tests in 8,000 locations across America, resulted in a legal settlement, whose terms were never disclosed. Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford at 19, convinced she was going to change the world. She raised $900 million. She built a $9 billion company. She appeared on the covers of Forbes, Fortune, and Time. The technology never worked. Not once. Not ever, she knew. She kept selling anyway.